As I continue to wade through the ridiculous amount of lore about the Boondocks in an effort to make a comprehensive series, I keep coming across things from the early 2000s era that I want to briefly discuss. One of Huey's main dislikes in both the comic strip and the show is BET, UPN, and other networks that made black shows at the time. He essentially felt that they pandered to the lowest common denominators by using stereotypical depictions rather than putting well thought out plot lines and shows on screen. Shows meant to educate and challenge in addition to entertaining. Obviously, I don't need to be the one to tell you that things from the early 2000s don't necessarily fit into the cultural zeitgeist now, and this is still a common criticism of shows and films from BET. I mean, did y'all see that Karen film? Tragic, atrocious. Huey picks on the Parkers specifically a couple of times, and I came across an episode of the Parkers that I think does some of the things Huey's looking for shows of this type to do, and I wanted to talk about it with you. In terms of the Parkers, I think this episode is one of its most subtle. Really quickly, The Parkers is a spin-off of Brandy's sitcom Moesha. The Parkers is about Nikki Parker and her daughter Kim as they both attend Santa Monica Community College and figure out where they're headed next in life. Kim is a typical dumb character, gotta have a dumb character. We also have the himbo best friend, the slim thick white girl best friend, Nikki's perpetually manless best friend Andalusia or Andel, R.I.P. Yvette Wilson, Nikki's whack love interest, Professor Ogilvy. It's pretty standard, but I do love it a lot, and it's still pretty funny. As whack as Professor Ogilvy is, Dorian Wilson's performance is always great. He's really good with the physical performing. I really like Ken J too. He was also on In the House, and he was funny in that show. Freestyle Unity needs to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That's an order, not a request. I'll actually talk about the show one day, but not right now. So in the season 3 episode, Lights, Camera, Action, Nikki gets a job as a caterer for a black sitcom called We Ain't Friends. The sitcom stars the legendary Jasmine Guy as Delilah and Mike Coulter as Lamar. On its face, this is a pretty typical setup. I remember a version of this plotline on Living Single at least twice, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and Living Color, The Wayans Brothers, plot where one of the characters gets a role on a show of some sort and overdoes it with their part. It's a pretty typical setup and leaves room for comedians and comedic actors to improvise their flamboyance in these scenes. But the way that the Parkers handles this is pretty unique. Nikki invites the professor to set and he shows interest in Delilah, which sets Nikki off, getting her a part on the show. She ends up being an awful actor, so they bring the professor in again to get her riled up again, then she overdoes it and she's fired. So let's really talk about things. First and foremost, the show is called We Ain't Friends, using a bit of BVE to tell the audience just who the show is looking to reach. Stevie also mentions that there are no white people ever cast on the show. In a similar vein, Professor Ogilvy, who is a phony wannabe snob, looks down on the show but watches it because it's like a guilty pleasure for him. So we can assume that We Ain't Friends is a show like The Parkers, a sitcom meant for a black audience that uses typical tropes that are often looked down upon by television watchers that think they have more sophisticated taste. However, due to the popularity of the show, they can't help but be drawn in by it and likely hear about it from others. Her first day on the set, Nikki makes collard greens and oxtail for the cast and crew. The director, a white man named Basil, calls it spinach and lamb.
Nikki? That spinach and lamb was divine.
Oh, thank you, Basil, but it was collard greens and oxtails.
So we can sense that there's a cultural difference between Nikki and the director, which makes you wonder why he's directing this show, right? A show that is very clearly meant for a black audience and is clearly trying to sound like it's being made by black people. Right? If there's a significant cultural difference between himself and the show's target audience, Basil can't be catering the show to that audience well. Right? There's also the fact that Stevie mentioned that there aren't usually white people on the show. The idea that Nikki made oxtail and collard greens for the cast and crew can also lead us to infer that most of the crew is black. So what is he doing here? The answer is simple. He represents the white executives that profit off of black stories. For example, do you know who wrote the classic, extremely exaggerated and embellished film Lean on Me? And that awful Tupac biopic? Who wrote that? And who wrote Akeelah and the Bee? Exactly. And Coach Carter? There it is again. Those are on the top of my head. This is so common that I've actually been accused of being white and profiting off of black stories. I'm black, by the way. And I'm not saying that you can't like these titles or that we can only be involved with stories about our own race. That's silly and it would never work. But I'm saying that Basil represents the way that marginalized groups are integral to the final product. They just aren't allowed to make decisions about how that product is created. Let's look at some other things this episode covers. Professor Ogilvy comes down to the set at Nikki's invitation and begins trying to make a move on Delilah, which sets Nikki off. On her typical "don't touch my man, I'm a stalker" rant about the professor. After seeing her threaten violence, Basil is convinced that she's the perfect actress to play the antagonist on the show.
I love it! You do? Oh, Nikki, you're exactly what this show needs. Now the scene has passion, fire, wit!
You like her?
I love her!
The previous actress had an issue with being drunk and difficult to direct. Basil took the first opportunity to create as much drama and foolishness on the show as he could. A very popular show. I'm willing to bet that there are plenty of union actresses that would have loved to do this role, and instead, he hires the caterer, who very nearly hurt his lead actress. I'm tempted to say that this is more typical of smaller productions because there are less regulations in place, but it's not unheard of for directors to put their actors in danger. Here's a thread about it that links to several different stories about directors being on bullshit, basically. During Nikki's only true acting experience on We Ain't Friends, she has a hard time getting her lines right since she's not an actress. She does get the lines right, she sucks because she's not an actress. Thanks to Andell, they get the idea to use the professor to get her to act up again. Nikki begins to violently assault Delilah, and Basil has to be convinced to cut the scene. Look at him. He's loving this shit. After Basil gets all the shots he wants after having set up both Nikki and Delilah for a violent conflict, he fires Nikki as if she didn't do exactly what he told her to. As if he wasn't sitting there chomping at the bit for Nikki to rip Delilah's head from her shoulders. As if he wasn't a part of orchestrating the entire ordeal. He wanted to let Nikki take things even further. Just look at his face as he's forced to stop things. What about the ratings and money? While it's implied that Nikki and Kim will never have careers in acting because of what happened here, Basil will be fine. Even if he hadn't helped orchestrate things, they still would have taken place under his leadership, and he would still be fine. There's so much room for good faith 2020's criticism about the Parkers. For example, Nikki is literally a stalker, and when she finally finds loving romantic relationships, which happens several times in the show, she always goes back to being a stalker, and no one tries to fix it because she's scary or something. That's dumb. But to say that this show was nothing but low-hanging fruit is a little disingenuous to me. There are definitely moments when the show is trying to make a statement. There are newer sitcoms that do a better job balancing humor and commentary. The Upshaws is a really good example. I've had a video in the chamber about that show for a while. But The Parkers has a handful of episodes like this that mix in the commentary pretty well, and I love being seen agreeing with Huey Freeman or with Aaron Magruder. But I don't know, I think this one was a mess a little bit. Bye.